to SAB's State of the Beer Economy live stream. My name is Uspe Wagwavundla, and I'm honored to serve the South African breweries as the brand director for SAB Corporate. As one of the largest brewers, SAB is really proud to bring you this panel discussion today, which will help you to see beer differently, demonstrating its role in the economy and unpacking how our position on excise tax will help our economy to recover. As a company with a great heritage in this country, it's important for SAB to quantify this critical industry that supports over 1 million livelihoods. We're honored to have some of my amazing colleagues from SAB this morning. We've got our Director of Communities, Ms. Heidi Bartis. We have members of the SAB corporate brand team, our Head of Media Relations, Khanyisa Ndyonya, and Head of Digital, Tongai Jinda. We have Fatsani Banda, our economist and excise specialist. And we have from our Cape Region team, Tinum Zulbelwana and Julian Williams. I'd like to give a very warm and special welcome to our representatives from the Beer Association of South Africa and the National Liquor Traders Association. You'll have a chance to hear more from them as part of our esteemed panel shortly. As an industry, we are acutely aware that the challenges that we've faced over the past 2 years have really been horrific for so many industries. And at this critical time, where as a nation we need to recover economically, we really can't afford any more hindrances. And that's why we really want to shine a spotlight on excise tax, because that can be a really big obstacle. What we need as an industry is to support the country's economic growth ambitions by making sure that we ignite and empower our beer value chain of over 250,000 people from farm to sip. We've got a jam-packed morning today, which includes an in-depth panel discussion on the beer industry as a whole and its contributions in furthering this economic growth, with a special focus on, firstly, SMMEs and their invaluable contribution to our economy, given the past 2 years of struggle that they've had. We have localization as a point that we want to bring, where we believe that emphasis really must be placed on local procurement philosophies, where, for example, as SAB, we've got almost 100% of our procurement and sourcing from raw materials, from local and emerging farmers and producers. And of course, finally, certainty. In order for us to have the kind of environment that is going to help us recover, we do need to make sure that there are regulatory frameworks and policy implementation that create the kind of environment that will be conducive to economic growth and recovery. So we've got some very important discussion points this morning on the table, and we're really excited to make solid recommendations and contributions to our economy. Economic growth, however, cannot happen in isolation, but we need to collaborate with you, the media, industry players, the government, and the public at large. We really can, if we do collaborate, build, restore, and grow again. Please, those of you who are watching on social media, do engage with us on our social media platform using #TaxForGrowth. We'll be taking your questions as part of the Q&A session later on in the discussions today. And now to the business of the day. To help us unpack the role of beer in the economy, we have respected financial and economic journalist Fifi Peters, who is not only an anchor at CNBC Africa, but is also an award-winning financial journalist with a career spanning over a decade, having worked for the likes of Business Day, Financial Mail. She currently hosts CNBC Africa's flagship market shows, Power Lunch and Closing Bell, and has a special interest in African financial markets. Please put your hands together for Ms. Fifi Peters.
Thanks so much, Spe, for the very warm introduction. And I must also say that, not to blow my own horn, but I do also host the market update on SAFM with MoneyWeb. Just to declare that as well. I mean, when Spe was talking about the impact of the beer economy, talking about from farm to sip, I actually wondered if we'll be doing this discussion any justice without the sip. But perhaps it's a bit too early to be doing that at this point. So good morning to you all. Good morning to my fellow colleagues who are joining us also virtually. I am delighted to be spending the morning with you all here today to discuss a sector that not only supports our digestive economy, especially on a hot summer's day, but also pours quite significantly into the main economy. And we're going to hear just the extent to which all the hectolitres that are poured into the economy by the beer industry support growth, support jobs, and support income. much needed income for the revenue service that is SARS. So, as Ped had mentioned, I mean, we're having this conversation just, I think, with the budget just literally being around the corner. And as is always the case, we do know that this industry will be asked to pay a little bit more for its sins, as it were, through higher taxes. And I think that we all know it happens. It happens all over the world. South Africa is not unique. But perhaps in our sense, a case can be made that the tax treatment can be a little bit different this time around. So we're all aware we're in the third year of this thing called the COVID-19 pandemic. And what is encouraging is that the road ahead is looking a little bit clearer, touch wood. But that's not to say that one needs to ignore the damage that has been done over the past 3 years. And the damage, particularly in the liquor industry, in which not only were there lockdowns, but there were significant restrictions to the sales that could happen. So today we will be hearing in further detail the extent of the damage, the state of the beer economy, as it were, as things are looking presently, and what SAB, as a significant player in the economy, is saying about the role that it wants to play in supporting the recovery, and how its role as a supporter of the recovery can be made a little bit easier. What its asks specifically from government are in doing so. So as Per said, I mean, we've got quite a number of speakers that are lined up from across the industry to give us their expert insights into exactly what has been happening on the ground. And I'd like to introduce them to you now. And as I introduce them, I'd also like them to come up and take their seat on the stage. So beginning with a lady who will give us a greater sense of what the state of the beer economy is looking like presently, and how it can be a catalyst to support the recovery from the pandemic. Ms. Fadzani Banda, who is the chief economist at SAB and an excise specialist. In fact, she is the lady who is behind the excise strategy to government on behalf of SAB. So Fadzani, I would like to ask you to come join me on the stage. Just a bit more color on her. She has her honors degree from Wits, where she did specialize in economics and development theory as well as policy. She's worn a different hat in the public sector as a, I wonder how long ago that was, but as a research analyst at Parliamentary Budget Office, and she'll be here to demystify some of the complexities around excise. Please, can we give her a round of applause? And then we also have Dr. Azar Jamin, who I'll also ask to come to the stage. Director and the chief economist at Econometrics. He is a very familiar face to the media fraternity. In fact, Dr. Jamin, yesterday when my father picked me up at the airport and I was telling him about this program and I told him that you'd be one of the speakers, he said, wow, is that guy still commenting? And he did. He said he used to buy the papers, the Sunday papers, you know, in a pre-pandemic world, and would always see your name come up. So very highly respected. Just a bit of color around Dr. Jamin. Credentials. 1976, he was at the London School of Economics. He did his PhD at the London Business School as well. 1985 is when he came back to South Africa and started to take up the position as director of chief economist at Econometrics, and it is a job that he has occupied ever since. We also have, and at this juncture, I will ask them not to come onto stage, but perhaps just to wave a bit, stand and just allow you to get familiar with their faces. Ms. Patricia Pelle, who is the CEO of the Beer Association of South Africa. Patricia, could you just kindly stand and wave to the room and wave to the cameras, because you've got people online. So Patricia wearing quite a number of hats, not only her current role as CEO of the Beer Association of South Africa, she's also got the hat of attorney of the High Court of South Africa and is a certified part-time commissioner of the CCMA. That's actually really good detail to know. She was responsible for establishing the Consumer Goods and Services Ombud in South Africa and still plays an active role in the space as the chairperson of the Society for E-Customer Care Professionals. So just a warm applause for her, if we could please. And last but not least, a gentleman who probably also doesn't need any introduction. Many of us have become quite familiar with him throughout the pandemic, as he has really led the charge and the impassioned plea when the alcohol bans were in place for them to be lifted, representing the smaller guys, as it were, but the important guys in the small to medium enterprises sector, as well as the taverns in the township economy, Mr. Lakin Timani, but just to stand for the purpose of familiarity. Thank you, sir. From the National Trade Liquor Council. And in fact, he is really going to be giving us an understanding of what the situation on the ground is looking like. In fact, Chief, I'd argue that the pandemic made you quite famous, but nonetheless. So with that said, and the formalities, and it's the State of the Economy address, so there had to be formalities. I can say at the stage, all protocol has been observed. There will be an opportunity for all of you to engage. I know that your time is really precious. You have questions, and you will be given the opportunity to ask them. And that's to my fellow colleagues here in the room, as well as my fellow colleagues who are joining us virtually. There'll be a formal Q&A session. In fact, what you can do is you can start, particularly those who are sending their questions online, you can start sending your questions, even if you have questions prior to this event, through, and we will get to as many as time does allow. As was mentioned in the introduction by Spare, if you also would like to reach out to us on social media, feel free to do so. Just use the hashtag #tax4growth. Right, and that's as far as my heels can carry me at this moment, so I'll take a seat and let's get the show officially on the road. Fatsani, as our host and also as a lady, I mean, there's some things that the pandemic hasn't disrupted, and that is, the old way of doing things in terms of ladies going first. Right. So you have invited us in your company today, in your company's company, to help us better understand the world that you understand very well, and that is excise. So please start off the conversation for us. Just demystify any complexities that some of us may have around excise duties, how they work, how they do impact the beer industry as well as the country at large.
Thanks, Fifi, for the introduction, and thanks for everyone that has taken the time to be in attendance for this State of the Beer Economy address. I'd like to first mention that as soon as SAB began putting on the table our budget expectations, there was a clear disconnect between the understanding of what excise taxes means. And this go to show itself in the way that I was being introduced. I was once referred to as the SAB economist and exercise specialist. And on another platform, I was referred to as the SAB economist and SI, I'm presuming special investigative specialist. And needless to say, this is a great opportunity, as you said, to really provide the clarity and the detail to what exactly excise taxes are and what commonly is referred to as sin taxes. But really, excise taxes are one of the basket of tax categories that our government and the National Treasury itself has an opportunity to use to increase revenue and obviously fund expenditure items. Excise taxes by nature are guided by two principles. Firstly, to increase the public finance, and then secondly, to really deal with the negative impact that some markets, through goods or services, are able to create a negative impact through their supply and demand. So what the government tries to do is to curb this negative impact by way of increasing consumer prices. And this is the idea that consumers are disincentivized to purchasing certain products by way of an increase in price. What is not included in this complexity of excise taxes is the fact that prices do influence manufacturers. And as SAB, we're saying price matters. And an excise tax that is above inflation or outside of an excise policy in place makes it difficult for us to be competitive. It makes it difficult for us to continue to have a business planning or business viable model, and it makes it difficult for us to cover our cost. And this is essentially the entry point for SAB, is that we want to be included in the formation and obviously the implementation of excise taxes. And that's just an overview of sort of the principles guiding excise taxes and where exactly SAB fits into this conversation. Fundamentally, at a State of Beer Economy address, it wouldn't be possible to not give a sense of what is actually going on. And it's been great because the Oxford Economics Unit has just commissioned only 2 weeks ago a comprehensive global economic impact of the beer industry. And this also has been nuanced to give detail to the South African beer industry and the impact that we have. So at the top of it is to really say, let's highlight in a corroborated way the positive role that the beer economy has to the global economy and to the South African economy. And the nuance is to really say we're in a context where we're in the third year of a pandemic that seems to be less uncertain than it was in its early days, and to highlight the beer economic footprint in a way that says we're able to potentially, given the chance, contribute substantially to the recovery story, not only globally, but in South Africa. So what do the stats say? From the 2019 data put together by Oxford Economics Research, we have seen that over $550 billion has been contributed to the global economy by the beer sector. Over $262 billion has been contributed to taxes via the global beer industry. And lastly, over 23 million jobs has been contributed by the global beer industry in 2019. If we focus this down to South Africa, we see that $4.9 billion in 2019 alone was contributed by the beer value chain. And over $3 billion worth of taxes was included into tax revenue by the beer industry. 250,000 livelihoods, as our corporate director has stated, continues to be a big pride and a holding pride for the beer industries that we continue to support livelihoods. So in the context of economic and tax relief and recovery, we're now at the point where we say how much can we contribute to the recovery story? And is there room and space to really deep dive into the public policy space and the opportunity that the government has to influence that space and say excise taxes are important, but so is the recovery story, and how do we balance that off in a substantial way that doesn't hinder our business model and our opportunity to contribute, but actually gives us space and room to be part of the recovery story in South Africa, and that's our entry point.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Fatsani. That was a really interesting study, by the way. I had the opportunity just to glimpse through it, and it was really encouraging and surprising to learn that the entire contribution, that $559 billion of the world industry, is the size of Belgium's GDP. And also the 23 million jobs that the global industry does support is the size of Italy's population. So that's just by the by. But having set the case for what SAB is looking for, you're not saying that you don't want to pay excise, but you are saying that perhaps this time around, in order to support the recovery, let that excise be somewhere in line with inflation. So we'll unpack that a little bit more, but just to hear from Dr. Jamin to give us a perspective of what is happening in terms of taxes in other parts of the world. Last week I had a conversation with a lady in the industry, in fact one of your competitors as SAB, I won't mention the name, but she was also preempting higher taxes from the government as governments looked for different ways to collect revenue to support a recovery that is quite fragile. Also making the case that perhaps at this juncture it, protocol. Wow.
Sorry, that's
All right.
totally embarrassing.
No problem at all. It's just, I think that most of us are not really used to being in a physical eventing and conferencing once more, and I should have also made the announcement that can we have all our phones turned off or please placed on silent, especially for those of us who are physically here and don't have the support of the mute button on their computers, so don't worry about it at all. Yeah, just give us a sense of what is happening elsewhere in the world, how other governments are looking at taxes right now, as many governments are stretched and are looking for revenue to support the expenditure that will be needed to grow post-COVID-19.
Thank you very much. I'd like to obviously speak about what the world is doing, but also in the context of the South African situation, what the impact of excise duties has been. And then I would also like to give a perspective of the fiscal situation that exists in South Africa currently, and in the context of that, what opportunities there are to address the excise problem. Globally, over the last 20 years or so, there has been a marked and definite move to move away from direct taxes in the form of personal tax and corporate tax towards indirect taxes linked to taxing people on the basis of how much they consume. And this has facilitated, in many instances, marked reductions in things such as personal income tax rates and corporate tax rates. And of course, one of the vehicles through which indirect taxes can be increased, the main one obviously being VAT, but also excise duties. And it's been fairly effective that way. Indirect taxes have also been increased sharply on goods related to carbon intensity, with the result that fuel prices globally have tended to escalate more steeply than other prices, because the tax on fuel has been raised as a means to kill two birds with one stone, to generate more tax on the one hand and enable personal tax and company tax rates to come down to provide greater incentives for productivity and investment respectively, but secondly also to enable people to move away from using fuel to help the environment. To some extent, excise duties on alcoholic drinks and tobacco has carried the same kind of logic, to get people to drink less alcohol because it's supposedly bad for your health, although in some instances there are recommendations to have a bit of alcohol to feel better, but also the same thing with tobacco. The key here is, however, to keep some balance. And what most countries in the world have succeeded in doing is to limit the extent to which they've increased excise duties on alcohol and tobacco, to the extent of not, trying to dissuade people from consuming them a little, but not completely destroying the economic activity that is involved in that instance. What we have seen in South Africa, on the other hand, has been that the more that excise duties have been increased at rates in excess of inflation, and here I must refer to the last financial year, for example, where the excise duty on alcoholic drinks, beer, was increased by 8% in the face of an inflation rate of 4.1%, so there was a real increase of 3.9%, is to make the cost of alcoholic drinks rise by more than the general inflation rate. The idea has been to encourage people to reduce their alcoholic consumption for health purposes, but the effect, a perverse effect, has been to increase illicit trade. And I have to give my own personal experience of this. A few years ago, I was asked to look into excise duty on tobacco products. And the argument, and I saw the data, was that as excise duties kept rising faster than inflation, so the proportionate growth in excise duty generated by the government diminished, not increased. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the illicit trade was basically attracted to the industry to generate, because people were saying, well, I'm not going to pay all that for drinks, I'm going to go to illicitly and get it much more cheaply. And the extraordinary longer-term effect is, admittedly, COVID played a role, and the ban on the sale of alcohol and tobacco products had a role to play. But we now have a situation where 40% of trade in tobacco products is illicit. And I would suspect that the alcoholic industry may not be anywhere close to that figure, but there's a tendency there also for illicit trade to proliferate and to result in the proportionate benefits in terms of increased excise revenue actually diminishing as the rate of increase in excise duties increases in excess of the overall inflation rate. So there's your very first warning sign. The second detrimental effect that we're going to hear about later today is that what has happened is, especially in the context of the ban on sales of alcohol, is a lot of your small companies involved in the industry have been wiped out. And there's a lot of evidence that may be given later today to bear this out. And in the context of President Ramaphosa pledging that national economic policy is going to be driving towards enhancing small business activity as a vehicle through which to create proportionately far more jobs than are created by big businesses and government, there is a lot to be said for actually alleviating the burden on small businesses involved in the alcoholic production activities of South Africa, to enable them to thrive and to actually create employment. And I will refer now to the numbers involved here. At the moment, if I look at the budgets in the medium-term budget policy statement, we're looking at total excise duty in South Africa budgeted to account for 3.2% or 42.3 billion rand, 3.2% of total government revenue. That compares with 540 billion rand budgeted for personal tax, 375 billion for VAT, 289 billion for corporate tax, 42.3 billion for excise duties. And of course that encompasses excise duties on alcoholic drinks and on tobacco products, and within alcoholic drinks, of course, beer is just one portion of that. We're probably talking about a figure of 15 billion rand in excise duties, and the small players account for less than 1% of that. So the amount of excise revenue that the government is reaping from small brewers is maximum 150 million rand. I don't know the exact figures, but it could be at most 100 million rand. Now, really, that would not be a huge sacrifice to actually give away some margin in that regard. Firstly, for the industry as a whole, by not increasing excise duties by more than inflation, and secondly, in the case of the small businesses in the industry, to just give them a complete break from excise duties, if that's at all possible, because the revenue sacrifice is so minute, and yet the impact on a whole industry around the country and tourism as a whole, and the knock-on benefits in terms of employment creation, could be proportionately far in excess of the 100 million rand or so revenue sacrifice that would thereby be incurred. Having said that, let me paint the big picture now, looking ahead at the budget. There is a further very important reason why such a concession could be made on this occasion, and that is the very good news. We have been surprised over the past year by just how strongly the South African economy has recovered. This time last year, when the government formulated its 2021-22 budget, it was forecasting economic growth in the region of 3%. By all accounts, we have nearly got to nearly 5%. A lot of that has had to do with the fact that the world economy recovered a lot more quickly and more aggressively than had been anticipated. Firstly, vaccines were developed and rolled out successfully a lot sooner than had been anticipated. Secondly, the world economy benefited enormously from massive, unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus. I mean, the Americans started dishing out checks of $1,000 a month for 3-4 months to people to enable them to cope with COVID-19. And the result of that has been a very strong increase in the demand for commodities. Commodity prices have increased sharply. As a result, South Africa's exports have soared, exports mainly of minerals have soared. Our mining and mining-related companies have seen their profits increase massively. And as a result, the tax revenue that is being collected by government has shot all predictions right out. And in the first 9 months of the current fiscal year, that is April to December, the government managed to raise 270 billion rand more in revenue than it had budgeted for in February last year. And in the case of company tax, the increase has been over 100%. In the case of personal income tax, 15%. In the case of VAT, 18%. And in the case of excise duties, 69.6% from my figures.
Sure.
So it's collecting a hell of a lot of money, more than it anticipated. Well, sure, that has enabled it to budget to prolong this 350 rand a month special social grant to people who are unemployed and cannot gain access to any other social grant. And that, according to my estimates, will cost it an extra 44 billion rand. But that is affordable in the context of the 270 billion rand extra that they are receiving. The big question that Finance Minister Gordon Ngwana is faced with is, how long can he rely on that bonanza from higher commodity prices to last? And he's obviously decided that 44 billion for a special social grant is worth taking the risk. But what we are seeing from the left, or from populist pressures, and I believe there's going to be protest action on Wednesday or Thursday by the trade unions, for the introduction of a basic income grant. Now, and they're calling for every adult in South Africa to get 1,500 rand a month as a grant. Now, if you do your calculations, that amounts to 720 billion rand extra that the government has to face. That is 1.5 times as much as personal income tax is collected through the whole economy. And it's about 50 times the amount that is collected from excise duty. What I'm saying is, in the context of these discussions, the puny amount of 100 million rand collected from small business craft brewers, and I'm saying 100 million may even be an exaggeration, really it falls into total insignificance.
Sure.
And it makes the possibility of giving them a break, at least for a year, really very attractive. And also, it also means that more generally for the alcoholic industry, there is a need to limit the increase in the excise duty and keep it at most the 5% odd inflation rate that we are going to be facing in the coming year. How much can we rely on these commodity prices to carry on giving us this bonanza? Funnily enough, the consensus, and I think the National Treasury shares that consensus, is, this is a once-off, let's not be too complacent. It could fall away significantly, especially if the world economy starts slowing down in the face of rising interest rates and the withdrawal of liquidity, the withdrawal of quantitative easing, as it's called. I could go on about that. And the withdrawal of some of the relief measures that have been introduced to help people cope with COVID-19. So there is a definite chance that the world economy is going to slow down. But ironically, and on top of that, there are geopolitical risks. Especially in the last couple of weeks, there's been this fear that Russia would invade Ukraine. You know what's been remarkable in the face of all these pressures for a sharp reduction that we may experience in global economic activity? Commodity prices, if anything, have actually risen. They've done far better than anyone anticipated. Why? For a number of reasons. Firstly, in the wake of all this massive stimulus to the global economy over the last year, inflation around the world has surged, and that has put pressure on central banks to start raising interest rates. But commodity prices are actually now being seen to be hedges against inflation. Secondly, in the situation where the world is moving towards energy efficiency and carbon neutrality, investment into things such as extracting oil or coal has actually fallen off sharply. But, you know, this move towards carbon neutrality is going to take a decade or 2 or 3. And in the interim, the world still needs oil and coal to operate. And suddenly there's a shortage of these minerals. So in South Africa's case, the coal price has nearly doubled, and it's one of our biggest mineral products. So we are benefiting enormously. Thirdly, you've got a new boom in new technologies, such as electric vehicles, etc., that demand increased usage of key minerals that we produce, such as copper and palladium and rhodium. So those prices are now still holding up extremely well, and in the case of gold and platinum, they are seen as hedges against global inflation and geopolitical unrest, and so they are holding up. And who knows, this commodity price boom could just last a lot longer than we are anticipating, and therefore this flow of increased government revenue may last a lot longer than we actually anticipated.
Okay.
Now, I'm saying in the context of that, to give a little bit away in terms of sacrificing the revenue collected from small craft brewers, and to the extent of sacrificing a little bit of additional revenue in the form of excise duties, keeping them to levels equal to inflation and not above inflation, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Dr. Jamin, giving us the numbers and just giving us a really good perspective of what things are looking like right now. I mean, you mentioned the increase in commodity prices. I'm sure, Fatsani, you know that very well, with maize being quite a key input in making beer. And those increased prices also perhaps increasing the cost to make the beer on your part. But I'd like to circle back to the excise conversation. And what has happened historically, in the sense that we have seen above inflation increases in excise. And I suppose in South Africa's context, we cannot ignore the fact that we have a big drinking problem. Maybe not all of us, but a significant amount of the population do. And perhaps this is the view that government is coming from, to say in raising the excise at the quantum that we have been, we are playing our part in trying to minimize the harm that the alcohol abuse does do in some corners, which could be a question that you get, to say that if you are, as an industry, taxed at a lower level, how will you also balance and play your part in ensuring that your product doesn't become more accessible to those who presently are abusing it?
What I think happens in terms of harmful consumption is that we narrow it, and narrow the dealing of harmful consumption of alcohol in particular to excise taxes. And I think that's a little bit facetious to think that only prices influence the way in which consumers consume alcohol. Moderation and encouraging moderation in drinking not only beer but across all alcohol categories needs to be fundamentally led by the idea that low alcohol and it's actually high alcohol content products that actually drive up harmful consumption that affects society. So firstly, one of the pillars in dealing with harmful consumption is acknowledging that high alcohol content is really the driver of an increase in harmful consumption. Secondly, putting in place more than excise taxes through programs, and SAB has been dedicated substantially its resources, and our corporate brand director can speak to this extensively, to dealing with responsible consumption in a way that says increasing prices are not the only levers in which society responds to drinking, in a very conscious and awareness behind the way in which we drink. Harmful consumption continues to be one of the principles driving excise taxes, and SAB is cognizant of that. But we would like to re-emphasize that SAB is in the business of collaborating with the government on dealing with harmful consumption, and together we can get to reduce the negative impact of the harmful consumption of alcohol. But in itself and alone, we're really driving a narrative by ourselves that really requires both social partners to come to the table, and we're doing our part in our own way, but our forward-looking strategies to really come together with government in terms of increasing what we do in dealing with harmful consumption, which we acknowledge, by the way, but our position is not to limit the dealing of harmful consumption through excise taxes alone. One of the residual effects of trying to see excise taxes as a panacea for dealing with harmful consumption is the rise in illicit alcohol, and that consumers do tend to substitute away from different alcohol categories as price increases. And the idea is not to use price alone, is to say that, well, we don't want you to substitute to something else that's illicit and probably not verified as a product worth consumption. We actually want you to change your behavior and towards moderation. And I think that's the sentiment. And insofar as we see excise taxes simply influencing prices, we do see the growth of the illicit alcohol market, which grew up to 22% as a result of the bans, which really wasn't good for reducing harmful consumption, but it also wasn't good in general for the industry because it actually put a burden on legal taxed alcohol, which had to compete essentially with the illicit alcohol market. So it really does require nuance. But as I said, excise taxes are not a panacea for dealing with harmful consumption. It does require comprehensive strategy that needs to be in collaboration between the public sector and the private sector.
All right. I just wanted you to say it because I think that we're all aware of that, just given the fact that the alcohol abuse problem in this country hasn't actually gotten better over the years despite the increase in excise. But it brings me to another question for you, Fatsani, just piggybacking off what Dr. Jamin was saying in terms of how long this commodity bonanza could last that this government is currently experiencing and is playing towards its favor. A whole lot of factors you put down, and I probably would add to the fact that China is going in the opposite direction. It's continuing to support its economy, and one wonders what that effect of increased stimulus by way of lower interest rates and all that will have for China's demand for commodities. So we don't really know how long it's going to last, but the picture is looking like it's going to be around for a while. With that said, can you give us the exact figure, if you have, in terms of the excise that you are looking and are comfortable to pay as an industry to be responsible taxpayers, but also play a role in supporting the economy, and tell us how long you want that level of increase for excise?
I think the idea is to say we have an excise policy in place, and the 2014 excise policy gives the parameters by which we would want to see the excise rate adjusted, which is in line with inflation. And this creates the sort of certainty that allows us to plan our investments and allows us to stay as a viable business. We are for tax compliance. We are in principle encouraged by the fact that there is a call for an excise framework, but we are worried about the inconsistencies and the uncertainty it creates, as Dr. Jameen pointed out, when excise is increased by above inflation. And that's been the position of SAB, is to not want to take the role of a public policy interventionist, which is a role that the government does and plays well. Our idea is to say that we are the private sector and we would like to continue to increase jobs and investment as we go forward into a recovery state. What that looks like is a tax relief that recognizes, and this is across the board globally, and South Africa is in an isolation of that, what, for instance, has been going on in African countries and what has been going on in developed countries, which is to say, give the beer industry a break. There are huge job multipliers, there are huge economic multipliers that we're cognizant of, and a relief package that puts on the table even 0% increase in excise, for instance, in the medium term is the sort of sentiment we're seeing across the globe. And how far we are from that, particularly from the 8% increase we experienced last year, is something telling about whether we're given an enabling environment to really focus on what we do, which is increase jobs and increase the investment in this country. And that's really our angle, is not to be prescriptive, but to really be more nuanced in the way in which excise taxes are implemented, but to obviously give the government our sentiment as we go forward beyond the pandemic.
Okay, wonderful. So we have a couple of questions that have started coming through from the social platforms, notably Facebook, which is really nice. I'd like to ask first if there are any questions to any of the speakers here in the room. You can just indicate by raising your hand. And we do have roaming mics that will come to you so that you can ask your question. Perhaps you guys are still thinking about it, which is perfectly fine. In the meantime, I will start taking some of the questions that are coming through from our social colleagues today. And it's just really speaking to the magnitude of this task that SAB is asking the government to take on board. So for Zani, I'll perhaps come back to you here and ask, and this the question comes from Beauty Malepa, and she's asking, given just how big of a task this is, are you planning to bring on other partners in the industry to strengthen your collaboration?
Is this with regards to harmful consumption, or?
I think she's speaking about the plea for inflation-related increases on excise. I think. I stand to be corrected, but that's what it sounds like.
I think our later speakers will also reiterate, as they have already, the expectation ahead of the budget, which is to have an excise policy that creates certainty and that is guided by the principles already in place, which is an in line with inflation adjustment. I think the rally behind that position is to really say that in a time where we're considering recovery as critical for the South African economy, if we're going to go into the budget without any certainty, without an excise adjustment that is in line with inflation, it really hurts us in different ways. And we'll hear from our two latest speakers the nuanced way in which it hurts us. But overall, the sentiment is the same, is that we have a policy in place. And guided by those principles, we are in expectation as an industry, as taverners, as the beer value chain in general, that there is rationale for keeping excise in line with inflation. And I think that's an across-the-board agreement from different stakeholders interested in excise. Yeah.
All right, so it is a collaborative call to Beauty's question there. Dr. Jameen, I mean, you have voiced your personal opinion about what the industry is asking for, and the agents and factors right now economically that are supporting this. But you've also worked with this government for many, many years, and perhaps you understand the nuances of their thinking and how they could be looking at this plea right now. Just give us a sense of how big a task you think that this government will think that this plea that the beer industry is making could be for them.
That is obviously a very, very nuanced question, and the reality is that they make their decisions long before, and the National Treasury has a long-term plan, and they budget years in advance. and to some extent, I suppose that limits their flexibility, so they are they are, I suppose, not likely to change their minds all that quickly. But, on a daily basis, I have to come back to the extent of the overrun in revenue. Developments are taking place on a daily or weekly basis, and they need to be fully aware of the dynamism of the environment that exists. And therefore, I would like to think that they can operate a little more flexibly in actually approaching this. For example, I was very critical back in May when the special social grant of 350 Rand a month expired at the end of April, and they didn't extend it at the time, because already then it was obvious that revenue overruns were going to be huge, and that the revenue sacrifice, the additional expenditure in just prolonging that special expenditure giveaway was the environment was conducive towards just extending it. They didn't do so. 3 months later, we had huge looting in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Why? Because a lot of these 10 million people who were relying on 350 Rand a month, suddenly that 350 Rand a month was no longer there. They were desperate. And then the government reintroduced the special social grant again from the 1st of August. The damage was done. And similarly here, they've got to be very wary and try and be proactive for a change, and forget some element of inflexibility in this whole budgetary process, and be able to adapt a little more readily to some of the dynamism. Similarly, if suddenly commodity prices were to collapse and they were to run short of revenue, then consider increasing excise duties again as a source of additional revenue, even though, to some extent, what I'm saying is the amount that they collect from this is so minute compared with the total tax cake that it's worth actually ignoring it completely and favoring the job creation and investment in an industry that could be quite labor intensive and actually help a lot of people who are otherwise suffering a lot as a result of what's happened with COVID. By the way, that's the other thing to bear in mind. Players in this industry have lost heavily during lockdown. There is something to be said for giving them a break now to try and make up for the huge losses and squeezes on their cash flow that resulted from the closures of alcoholic outlets for I believe 160 working days of that's massive loss to the industry. Compensate them a little by giving them a break for a year or so to restore their financial health.
Sure. Can I play devil's advocate? I hope I won't be in trouble for asking this question, but we speak about the lost trading days of 161 days or so due to the ban. A lot of us in this room who do cover companies that are listed on the JSE, the big players, would have seen the blockbuster results in sales that alcoholic beverages are reporting, from the retail level of what the retailers are selling, even to the manufacturers. And I'm just wondering, for those of us who are asking the question as to whether those blockbuster headline figures at the top level are reflective of what is going down, what is happening on the ground. And I know we'll hear a little bit more from our next speakers about this. But Fazani, can you perhaps make a comment just regarding that?
I think if you think about how annual reports are reported, it's reported at a point in time. It doesn't really give you a trend analysis of what's happened. So really the devil is in the detail, by the way, is to really say, what is the trend? How were we before pre-pandemic levels?
Sure.
How efficient was our beer value chain? And there is obviously an impact to how our industry has been able to operate. That sort of detail, I think, is missed at aggregate level. If we are just to take annual report results, and to use that as a gauge for, well, they have been fine, they have survived. It's not actually it could be much better. and the recognition across the world that the beer economic footprint can invigorate and can create high economic multipliers and job multipliers is a reflection of that. Annual reports aren't necessarily a reflection of that. And adding more variables to the conversation does give a clearer picture of what exactly good performance is. And I think our newly appointed SAB CEO does give more nuanced, sophisticated analysis of what exactly the annual reports mean and how to interpret them beyond just seeing, an increase in profits is a good gauge of that business as well. And businesses, and we don't require, for instance, an economic and tax relief that says do more in terms of assisting the South African economy to recover. And that's really where the shade of dimension is to really understand on aggregate what annual report numbers are at the face of it.
All right, okay, perfect. I mean, the description or the picture that's coming into my head is annual reports are like taking a particular picture at a point in time, as you say, and, applying filters to mask some of the stuff that you don't necessarily want in that picture, but those filters actually take out all the other variables that you say inform the totality of the picture. So again, an extension to the guys on the ground. If you do have any questions, please do raise your hand. And one coming up from a fellow colleague of mine, and there's also one here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kaya.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Kaya Sitole from Power FM. I have a couple of questions. The first one is on the question of timing. As Dr. Jamin said, the budgeting process started way back in August last year. So this week is actually a confirmation of a process that has long been in the making. At what point in time do you start engaging with the state and saying, can you consider this? Because if it turns out that you started engaging last week, it's actually a waste of your time. That's the first one. The second one, Fatzani, I don't know if you've been able to sort of quantify the Laffer curve effect of, in tax. If at some point in time, if you tax people enough, they're going to stop paying taxes. Do you see the same manifesting in the liquor industry? I know Patricia will remember I was dribbling her about this last week, and that probably the most likely thing to happen is that if you keep increasing the prices, people are going to find different ways. And the evidence in front of us is that when there were lockdowns that started and you couldn't sell alcohol, I can tell you that I didn't struggle to find it. I'm not going to tell you where, of course, but the reality here is that we are a country where parallel markets and illicit trade is so prevalent. Isn't it self-defeating for the state to keep punishing the one part of the industry that complies with the rules, whatever the rules are at the point in time? Thank you.
All right. Shall we, okay, let's take another one, actually.
James Scott from Business Brief. Just a question on consumption. How elastic is consumption related to excise and other price increases?
All right. Ties nicely to Kai's question, given the fact that he didn't struggle to find when it was difficult to find in terms of that elasticity. So actually, a very important question. When did these talks around looking at excise duty begin?
Well, Kaya is very well knowledged in the parliamentary process and the budget cycle in particular, which you are as SAB. We have been engaging both National Treasury and the Standing Committee of Finance with regards to the amendment of the tax bills that had begun in August. These had been closed out much later than we would have anticipated last year because of the local elections. SAB has made several technical submissions to both the National Treasury workshops and has participated in the Next to See submissions ahead of the budget in December, including providing statistical information to National Treasury with regards to excise. So as Kaya aptly recognize that we are indeed at the final and dying stages of the budget, which is already finalized, but we have and are cognizant of the budget cycle, in particular the amendment of the money bills, the amendment of the fiscal framework, and how that process is already existing while running efficient process in which SAB has made technical submissions, has participated in public hearings in recognizing the constitutional and both the legislative process that takes place in finalizing the money bills, both in Parliament and as the custodians of the budget through National Treasury. Secondly, I mean, Kaya's hit the nail on the head. when he said that, how long can you increase excise above inflation without it really having a perverse effect on the industry? And I think we've seen it with the growth of the illicit alcohol market, is to really say, well, why be punitive to a legal tax-paying industry, tax-compliant industry, by allowing us to, or putting us in a space or in a room where we have to compete with illicit alcohol, where prices are, the variance can go up to 43% from our Euromonitor illicit alcohol report that was released in 2021. So, I mean, it really is the sort of detail when we say, it is a careful balancing act, but we can't resolve all the issues related to the existence of an alcohol market through excise taxes. And with the Laffer curve example, is to really say, to what point is it sustainable, and is it really counterintuitive to the principle that alcohol excise taxes rather should really influence consumer consumption. And back to the elasticities of consumers that we got from.
All right. Maybe before we get to the elasticities, I think
Right.
that Dr. Jamin wants to jump on one of the
Yes,
points you made.
in response to Kaya's question, I have a little anecdote that might interest you, and that is I was approached by one of the students of Arthur Laffer 3 years ago. Apparently, Laffer has toured around most of the world, giving his ideas of the more you tax, the less you get in tax revenue beyond a certain point. And he's had an innate desire to come to South Africa, which he's never done before. He is now close to 80 years old. He's been dying to come to South Africa. And I was approached to please try and attract interest in bringing him to South Africa and to approach the presidency in that regard. And I was sent a book to give to the presidential economic advisor on the idea behind the Laffer curve. And I sent it, and it was acknowledged, and that's the last I've heard of it.
When did you send it?
It's about 3 years ago.
Wow. Okay. Follow up. They've been fighting a pandemic. But just again, before you get on to telling us whether in good times or bad times we don't change our buying habits when it comes to alcohol, your engagements that did begin with this government in August, can you just give us a sense of how they have gone so far? What you can share. I know some stuff is confidential.
I think for the most part, our engagements have been to firstly address the 8% increase in excise, and Patricia from the Beer Association of South Africa had also participated as a consolidated position of the beer industry. Our main position was to say, look, we continue to value collaborating and engaging National Treasury, but we weren't necessarily getting the response that said engagement is important, particularly when we know that we need to start early with engaging on the budget cycle and taxes in particular. It doesn't make a difference, as Kaya pointed out, to start beginning this conversation 2 or 3 days before, even a month before, isn't really engaging the contents of the amendment of the tax bills. In Parliament in particular, as we went into the public hearings, our position was to say that an out-of-policy excise adjustment really creates uncertainty in the way in which the beer industry is able to operate viably. And it's actually created the growth and the illicit alcohol market to thrive. And really roping in excise taxes in line with policy, or review of the policy, so that it's consistent and allows tax compliant or stakeholders to pay excise taxes in a way that allows us also to plan for investments and growth, is really something that needs to be put on the table. So, I mean, those have been the major key aspects of our submissions, technically, and both through the public hearings, through the Standing Committee of Finance, as SAB and as the Beer Association, that we really needed to communicate, ahead of the tabling of the tax amendment bills and the finalization of the money bills.
Okay, so we've got around 5 minutes further to engage, and so I'm going to ask us to keep the rest of our responses really brief, perhaps to answer the question that did come from the floor, as the sensitivity, the reaction of consumers to higher taxes. Do we sort of take from other areas and make sure that we always buy our six-pack or our whichever six-pack you desire, or is there a point whereby you do see us having to turn away from having to buy our favorite six-pack because it's just become too expensive? How do you rate the sensitivity in increase in tax?
In terms of consumer elasticities, I think one of the big drivers of elasticities, and which we all know is disposable income and access to disposable income. And given the pandemic over the last 2 years, we've seen that the consumer trend is because of the limited access to incomes and the increase in unemployment, consumers generally want to trade down on alcohol, and that is to pursue cheaper alcohol. What we're saying is that excise taxes haven't been able to give us the room to really cater for price-sensitive consumers who really can't afford at a certain point, given the nature of the macroeconomic context, to continue to purchase alcohol at a certain price. The trading down, however, is there access to alcohol products that are legal, that have been verified and checked, and that we would say are able for consumers to consume in a really moderate way in the market. And what we have seen happen is that consumers generally have been able to access illicit alcohol, which tends to be cheaper. So on the elasticity argument, I think one of the main points is that consumers have become more sensitive due to a lack of disposable income, and in that sense, it's been really important for us to, as the price sensitivity of consumers increases, to give them an opportunity to trade down to low alcohol products, and for beer to stay there insofar as controlling for harmful consumption is concerned.
Okay, just a final one for you, Fatsani, in 2 minutes. It might take you, maybe I'll give you an extra minute or so. A very important question in terms of the recognition that, yes, a government has perhaps got the space to give you a little bit more relief as an industry in terms of taxes, but as a big beer company yourself, what are you planning to do to support many of the businesses that weren't able to make it through the COVID-19 storm? What are you planning to do, programs to help them get on their feet?
I think one of the fundamental pillars of SAB, we have our SAB Foundation. This is pre-pandemic levels, by the way. It's been one of our key pillars to really encourage the growth of entrepreneurial and innovative growth in small and medium enterprises, and that's beyond the pandemic. But I think the detail, and if we're going to focus on us being big business, is to really put on the table the public policy question about economic and tax relief, and that's outside of the purveyor of SAB, and that's where we want to really draw the line between what exactly SAB is able to do as a business, which is support the growth of entrepreneurship and small and medium businesses that want to not only be part of the beer value chain, but in general would like to grow as SMMEs. And that's been a running principle irrespective of the pandemic. But it's really to say that the public policy space is really where the government plays and plays well, and we're not trying to take that role away from the government. And in terms of economic and tax relief, we really see that is a role that the government can play in, but we can collaborate insofar as being able to create investment and increase jobs. And that's something in the space of a budget to really say we're looking forward and we're expecting, for instance, the minister to put on the table what is possible in terms of economic and tax relief, and the SAB and the beer industry to respond by way of investment, by way of creating job opportunities to assist in that. And that's sort of the dynamic that takes place between the private sector as SAB and between the public sector as government, and the ability to intervene.
All right. Okay, perfect. Fazani, I know that you're going to be staying with us, and Dr. Jamin, just final thoughts from you on the topic at hand.
Yes, I've got a couple of things to say. Firstly, one needs to recognize that the impact of COVID on our population has not been equally distributed. The poor have suffered proportionately far more than the middle class, who are still in their jobs and earning reasonably well. And in terms of the sensitivity to prices of a thing like beer tends to be consumed proportionately far more in relation to total consumption by the poor, and therefore slight changes in the cost of beer can have significant impacts on the consumption of beer, whereas a slight change in the cost of a motor car is not going to affect the consumption of that of cars that much. That's the first thing. The second point to make is, there are other huge economic policy challenges in South Africa, And when we talk about getting an extra 10 or 100 million here or there from excise duty, one needs to bear in mind that there have been tens of billions that have gone wasted through state capture and corruption. So in relation to the issue, to that issue, this is small fry, and the sacrifices that can be made are small fry compared with addressing some of the other major issues facing the South African economy.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, sir. Thanks so much for your insights. A warm applause for Dr. Jamin as well as Fatsani for setting us off. Thank you so much. And we are going to continue. There'll just be a little bit of a changeover in the sense that we will now be joined by Lucky and Patricia on the stage, who will be just giving us a closer a view and a perspective of what is happening on the ground, particularly amongst the smaller players in the industry, at the tavern level, at the township level, the craft brewers and the like. I think personally, for me, I'm quite encouraged at the fact that you know, there's been a lot of chatter that has been happening in the past year or so. So I think we'll all keenly be waiting to see whether that talk has been taken on board when the minister, of course, does deliver his speech on Wednesday. But could I kindly ask Lucky and Patricia to join us on stage? Fazani, you stay put. Welcome, welcome. I suppose just, I mean, by way of introduction, a lot has been shared so far. I don't know if you have any responding comments to what we've said and what we've spoken about so far in the past 45 minutes. I'm a ladies first kind of girl, so Patricia, beginning with you.
I've taken notes furiously because it's such an exciting topic, and it really gets me excited when we start talking about building this economy, and it gives me hope. Because I think we have so much potential, and I think that as beer, I just love this industry. And during the pandemic, I would get a few hate calls, and you know, being of Indian origin, I think people are like, "Oh, but you're a young Indian girl and you're fighting for alcohol," and I'd be like, "Actually, I'm fighting for livelihoods. That's what I'm doing here." And it gives me courage and hope when I hear Dr. Jamin talk about, you know, our country and the fact that we are doing well and we can do well. But I think if we continue to penalize industries that are promoting growth, that are supporting our agricultural sector, because if you look at it, I almost want to test you. What is beer made up of? Let's see how good our moderator is.
Maize, grain, water,
Hops, barley, water, yeast. That's what beer is made up of. And if you look at the growth of that industry, if we can get that industry going, if you look at SAB, I don't know if you know, but almost 100% of their raw ingredients are locally sourced. And if you look at everything that the president has said, it's all about localization. It's about supporting the economy in terms of young entrepreneurs, about the emerging sector. If you look at our craft brewers, this is the industry that we need to be supporting. So I'm really excited to be part of this. Thank you so much for having me here, and also to have my colleague here with me, Lucky, because everything that we do affects your industry as well, Lucky. And so I think let's get on with it, and really excited about today.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Lucky, I saw the exchanges that were happening between the both of you while Fatsani and Dr. Jamin were leading us in the conversation this morning. Just some brief opening thoughts and reflections that you have had so far.
Thank you so much. For us, it's always been a great privilege to partner with manufacturers, because they've been there for us since day one. I was reflecting with Patricia just this morning, reminding her of the 1st of June, 2020, when we met in Tembisa. And that was the first day that alcohol ban was lifted. And our structure as a National Liquor Traders, which is a public benefit organization, could not have been in existence if it was not because of the Beer Association of South Africa, and also as well as Distil. And for the fact that the manufacturers were willing and keen to ensuring that liquor traders unite to be able to engage with government so that we could protect our livelihoods and our lives, as it were, means that we have a collaborative effort that is not just on paper or in theory, but in action. So we see a role whereby we can continue to support government in the job creation space, as we know that liquor traders employ about 250,000 people in their space. So on average, a tavern will have between 4 and 6 people working there. And it's almost like an owner-driven enterprise, a sustenance type of a business where it's a hand-to-mouth type of a business. So if you close off that business for a day or two, you have literally killed them. So what we saw during the alcohol bans was that it made it almost impossible to sustain the township economy. We almost at some point felt that we're a stepchild of the South African economy because we're not being listened to. Government was not taking us into their confidence when they were making decisions that were affecting us. We still continue to complain to government even up to now that we're not being consulted on anything. We write countless love letters to government, and some of these ministers, they
You don't get love back.
no love back. Some of these ministers, they actually are comfortable, actually, by being, I'll use maybe this choice word for now, by being useless in addressing the economic challenges that face our country. I mean,
Be kind.
we need to be able to address the elephant in the room, where we have a minister, Ibrahim Patel, who was tasked with addressing the economic challenges that face our country. You only see him when he cuts ribbons, not where things matter. It's even difficult to see him. The best way to see him is to Google him.
So I come from a wedding just last week, and I remember the mother of the bride gave my cousin who was getting married and his new wife some advice to say that you guys will fight. You'll fight. There'll be challenges. But fight the problem, not each other. So I'd like us to rather fight the problem and not necessarily the individuals in the equation. So I'm going to take the mic back from you a little bit, sir, and just get into Patricia's point about the fight for livelihoods that is currently going on right now. And perhaps even before we flesh out that detail, just the basic economics of beer. Can you just flesh that out for us? As you did give me a test, I think I failed a little bit earlier. But inform me and inform those of us here in this room about the basic economics of beer. What is paid across what value chain? How much at the end of the day does a craft brewer get once those basic economics are done?
Okay, great. So I think that if you look at a craft beer, for example, and you look at a 340 milliliter beer, and out of that component, you would then have to pay for your logistics. You'd have to pay for your staff costs. You'd have to pay for excise. And out of that whole bottle, at least 22% of that is going for excise. And the retailer will take their margins. You'd have to look at your raw materials. You'd have to look at your packaging. Packaging is also high. And so when you do drink a craft beer and you wonder why is it so expensive, a large part of that is because of the excise. And so when you look at your margin that your craft brewer actually gets, they only end up with about 4%. And I think the point that we're trying to make is that after 161 days of not being able to sell that product and also having wasted product, because remember, we don't get consulted, as my colleague has said. So you have product in store that you had to dump and then pay SARS to dump it, just to add. I don't know if everyone's aware of that. You have to pay somebody from SARS before you dump any product to come and watch you dump it. So we're saying that 161 days of not selling your product now makes that product even more expensive because now you have to add on. So at the end of the day, you're sitting with a very small margin of 4% and a very high margin that's going towards excise of over 20% that goes towards your excise.
Right.
And we are saying, as especially the Beer Association, which represents not only your large SAB and Heineken, but also under 200. We were over 200 before lockdown, and now we're sitting at a very low, just under 150 craft brewers. We had 30% of craft brewers shut down. And we also had a malting factory that closed down that a lot of people don't know about. And these are all essentials to making beer. And I think that we're saying to government during this period, and like Fatsani says, we've been saying it throughout, this is almost a reinforcement of it. And maybe you can say it's a fait accompli because the decision's being made, and we hope not. And we hope that there is still consideration to say, give us a break. And the last point that I'd just like to share, and I will continue to stress this, is we do not get relief. As a beer industry, we do not get relief from government. There are various different packages that are given out there, levies and grants, etc. As the industry, we are considered the sin industry, and it was great. We had that caller, Kaya, who called in about the sin industry, and we are considered the sin industry. And they do not give us relief, sadly. We go to banks, they do not want to give us any loans. They do not want to give us funding. And yet we are a legal industry. We are trading legally. There's nothing that we're doing that's illegal in this country. And we do not get relief. So how are we supposed to survive? How are these people, very similar to Lucky's members as well, most of them husband and wives that start up this brewery. They start off with a little kettle and then they start moving on from there. How are they supposed to feed their children? And you talk about relief and the things we're doing. And I think that a lot of our members are very polite. They don't brag about what they do. But our members are the ones who gave us money during December when people didn't have money to give their children in terms of food and putting food on the table. And we had to give them checkers vouchers to feed them. And these are realities that we don't get published in the paper. And I wonder if officials that are making these decisions understand how bad it really is out there, because these are people's livelihoods that we are dealing with. So when you think of a concession, if you can afford it, Minister, give us a concession.
Sure.
As beer, give us a concession here. Allow us to recover. We have not recovered. We said in our previous calculations, we at least will take at least 2 or 3 years to recover as an industry. Give us a break, give us a chance to recover, give our businesses a chance to just get back to business, and then we can relook and allow us the policy certainty that Fatsani mentioned. We cannot budget. We cannot forecast if we don't have policy certainty.
And it's interesting that you're talking about recovery, and particularly recovery to pre-pandemic days, because again, I'd like to just make the point of the numbers that we have seen from the larger retailers in terms of their recovery. And you do have a recovery that is not only at pre-pandemic levels, but is a lot better than they were before going into the pandemic. And I just then, I mean, Patricia has painted the picture of the craft brewers quite succinctly. It's very unfortunate, the 30% of businesses that were not able to make it. But Lucky, can you just also give us a bit of a sense of the township and the taverns, your fellow colleagues and your friends, and how the situation is looking like now, particularly for those that were able to survive? I mean, has business as usual started again, or are there still pressures, and if so, what are they?
So you mentioned first around the recovery of the retailers. I think the retailers are in a much better space because if maybe I were to use Pick n Pay as an example, the grocery is a bigger component of their business, so they're able to subsidize the alcohol business. But once you start talking about the independents, your tavern, your bottle store, those do not even have access to funding, like Patricia had mentioned earlier, because of the word syntax, which, by the way, we have made a submission to the President and to the Minister of Finance to say, when the Minister of Finance makes a speech on Wednesday, he must not use that word, because we feel that as it's unconstitutional. It goes against the principle of Section 22 of the Constitution, which says we've got the right to choose any profession of our choice. So we feel the usage of that name actually goes against the spirit and letter of the Constitution. We are hoping that the minister will have heard that and actually gave him a call to mention to him that we must just get rid of that word, because it's really not in the positive light that it's being used. But going back to your original question, taverns have been struggling, and independent liquor traders have been struggling on a basis that if you close a tavern for 2 or 3 days, you have killed them. And some of these rely on the credit terms that they get from your Heineken, your SAB as well. And those businesses will require their money to be paid back. So all the money then is stuck in stock. But there was a major challenge that we experienced as taverns that were not aware that we could actually even encounter such. The risk to the stock that we kept in our premises. So we became targets, we became sitting duck to criminals who now all of a sudden saw that our black label beer that sells at the normal 17 rand, they could now sell it for 60 rand. So meaning that we had to employ securities to guard the stock. So not only were we sitting with the fact that we didn't have cash flow because we're not trading, but now we had to spend money to protect our stock because now it was worth more in the township space, and that has not stopped even though we are out of the restrictions. Now we are seeing weekly reports of taverns being targeted because people now know that they can still stock from taverns and go and sell in these newly created markets that now feeds into the illicit trade, which is now worth 20 billion rand. This is a big problem for us because it means now our tavern owners cannot close as per the license regulations because they are scared to carry on trading throughout the night. So they now have to close early. So meaning that they are now sacrificing the time that they have available to trade in their businesses, meaning that will hit their profitability. And now they've got kids to support, to send to school. They've got food to put on the table. So for us, the pandemic has really exposed us to a whole lot of undesirables. And we are worried about the sustainability of the tavern sector going forward because we cannot operate as we were. So for us, the recovery is a pipe dream. Hence, our call is actually 0% excise duty increase from government because we feel that we need to start somewhere. We haven't received
0%.
Yes, that's our call because we haven't received any support from government, even though we made those calls as far back as June 2020 to say to government, we need a 20,000 rand once off so that we as taverners can sustain ourselves, can continue to support our families, but also support the township economy. We never got any response to that. So we have now gone big and say we want a 0% increase because that will help us to sustain our businesses, but also aid in our recovery efforts and assist us to maintain our profitability so that we can maintain the jobs that we support in our tavern space.
Sure. Not to throw water on the plight of your industry or your demands, but perhaps the pessimist in me is saying that 0% might be a bit of a tall order for this government. That's how they might think of it, And in that sense, my question to you is, what if you don't get 0%? What if you get something that's in line with inflation? What does that mean?
So we feel that government cannot expect to milk a dying cow. Then that's what we are as tavern sector. So they really cannot expect that we can give them anything this time around, especially given that we have not been trading for 26 weeks out of the cumulative almost 18 months that we have been through the advent of lockdowns or the pandemic itself. Government has to find ways to make money. If they have to compromise so that they can support the 250,000 jobs that are currently sitting with the tavern sector, we feel that government should be able to do that. I'm sure Dr. Zamin will agree with me. So you need about a growth of 1% to sustain or create about 100,000 jobs in the economy. Given the economic state that we're in as a country right now, we cannot afford to lose any job. So the 0% excise that we are calling for will actually support the very same jobs that we currently have in the system. It is difficult for this government to create any jobs. We are saying as a tavern sector, we already have a base of 250,000 jobs. All you can do is to support us so that we can keep those jobs that we have.
All right, so a slightly different view to what SAB is calling for in the industry in the main, something that is aligned to inflation. Dr. Jamin, I don't know if you've got a view on a 0% excise at this juncture. Perhaps you can get a mic to Dr. Jamin as he does. Is there not a mic on the floor?
It's okay. It's all right, thanks.
All right.
I come back to the point that I made originally. A zero rate of increase in excise would mean on beer would entail a revenue loss to the fiscus of about 150 million rand if they compared with what they might otherwise have got. Again, that is minute compared with the excess revenue that is currently being collected. Much will depend on the extent to which the Minister of Finance is prepared to commit himself to this commodities price boom fading completely or continuing.
Okay. No, point received there. Fatsani, perhaps coming back to you, just as we are speaking about the Minister and these expectations around, sanitize, ma'am. There are expectations around and asks that have been aired by your various colleagues in the panel today. Just any further asks on your front, or any further tips on your front for the Minister of Finance on Wednesday?
Just as my colleagues have stated, there hasn't been enough economic and tax relief coming to the beer industry and the beer value chain in general. We are aligned with the position of our colleagues that by way of the budget speech and the position the Minister of Finance is in, he has the opportunity to change that and to put us all as small, medium, and microbrewers, as Patricia represents, and as taverners and the retailers, as Lucky represents, and as SAB in general, to really continue to encourage us to be part of the recovery story, not to isolate us or exclude us from that. I'll ask ahead of the budget, as SAB in particular, and Lucky is just obviously demonstrating the nuance towards the extent of not being or not having received economic and tax relief throughout the pandemic. But our ask, and given the precepts of the excise policy that does exist, is to say, in line with inflation, 2021 was a sobering year for the beer industry because we had not received any reprieve from excise, which put its own tax pressures, and from the COVID-19 regulations and restrictions. We're saying that we require certainty from the excise policy. We would like to invest. We would like to create jobs. We would also like to be the only and the predominant legal taxed alcohol industry, and that's to also close out the gap, the growing gap between illicit alcohol and legal taxed alcohol. By way of collaboration, we believe that in order to be inclusive in getting both the public and the private sector to participate in the growth of the South African economy, we do need to address the inconsistencies and some of the inefficiencies that come from the excise taxes. Excise taxes are big running costs, as Patricia has already highlighted, that can go up to 40% of the production of one bottle of beer. And that's the sort of nuance that hasn't been taken into consideration in the increases in excise taxes. We're a viable group of individuals, both as big business and small brewers and retailers, and we would like to stay as part of the cogs that run the economy. We are an industry that wants to be part of that. And in the short term, we would like to see an in line with inflation excise adjustment. In the long term, however, we would like to address the excise policy review and the inconsistencies that have come out of it, and that is to obviously put on the table as a discussion what exactly the excise policy review should be, given that it was last amended in 2014, eight years ago. And we do think it's time for really getting into the detail and saying what can we correct, what can we do better if we are going to have an excise policy in place.
Okay, interesting. Perhaps there will be a bit of time to probe you further on that in the long term, but let's deal with the short term and the medium term that we're facing. So I imagine that this government might have asked you throughout your engagements to say, okay, this is what you're looking for, this form of relief, fine. It's a relief that you haven't as an industry experienced throughout this pandemic, unlike some other industries. So then what are you planning? What are the tangible and actual commitments that you are proposing to put on the table? You did mention jobs. Can you flesh out just a bit of detail around what a relief would enable you to do by way of jobs? You even mentioned investments. Can you give us just a bit more detail on what that would enable you to do, where the investments would go, how much we are talking, just any amount of detail that you are able to share with us at this juncture?
One of the big decisions we have as SAB is where to put a brewery, and that's more at a practical level, where to put our depots, and that's more capital investment. And when that comes to the fore, what we do wait for is to say, what is the excise tax?
All right.
Because last year what we did budget for in line with inflation, and what we got was 8%, which was a $21 million difference between what we had planned for last year and what we were able to do. Now, if we put just 25% towards building a brewery, for instance, the upstream and downstream activities that are activated for locating an area or a province to put a brewery are incredible. I mean, the hospitality sector, for instance, is one of the downstream activities that benefits from the growth or the establishment of a brewery. So when SAB talks about what sort of investments do we have in the pipeline, we're saying where else can we create multiplier effects? Where else can we put a brewery in place? And what certainty is given from the government by way of excise in particular to give us the opportunity to do that? We can't afford to have a double inflation excise and then still give the sort of investment in the form of a brewery as an expectation. It just isn't balanced enough. And we really need that certainty to really give us a fair chance at saying, okay, let's set a plant, let's give people who are interested in being brewmasters and running depots and being part of the hospitality sector and being taverners or retailers an opportunity to enter the industry by way of giving access through capital investment into South Africa. And we really need that collaboration to come through. That's exactly the conversation that SAB is going to be a part of.
Okay, perfect. Just once again extending the invite to the floor to make any comments or ask any questions to the speakers. Just you can do that by raising your hand and we'll come to you. Is there a...
Sorry, James Scott, Business Brief. Just a little bit of a revisit to the actual calculation of excise. Is it obviously paid for by the brewer, and how's that actual calculation done? What is it based on? Is it just on total cost? Is it based on labor? Is it based on the inputs? Is it based on the retail selling price or the wholesale selling price? How does that calculation get made up, and is there any basis on which to get better clarification on that? That's really
For that, James. I suppose we can do that now.
Okay, so excise tax, by way of the policy, says that, and this is across the alcohol tax category, by the way. So wine has an excise rate, beer has an excise tax incident rate of 23%, and that's just a standard. 23% should be dedicated to excise taxes, and that increase, that's the nominal number, that's the nominal tax incident rate, but that obviously every year needs to be put into effect, or the real effect of that would be to add an inflation to get its effective excise rate. So for instance, if a brewmaster or a brewer or at a depot, for instance, where we have our bottles of beer, how excise is implemented is to say what is the alcohol content per bottle, and that's for the beer industry. It differs for every category, and the excise taxes are according to the different excise categories. For beer is to say if you have an ABV and it's a staggered excise system for beer, you have to pay more. So if we produce a beer at 4%, we pay a particular tax rate. At 4.5%, we pay more, and so on and so forth. And that's in the beer category. It does differ for spirits and for wine. And those are the sort of inconsistencies, because it should be the same. Harmful consumption is treated as a flat principle in terms of implementing excise taxes, but there are a lot of differences across the alcohol categories and how excise is implemented that really needs to be addressed. But I mean, in terms of the nuance, it's per alcohol content and is staggered for the beer industry, but the same does not apply for wine and spirits, and that needs its own nuance and recognition in that respect.
In fact, a question coming from Anita Moyo, just to the point about the different tax treatments of the different liquor categories, and I hope that does answer that question for you. And Fatsani, I don't know if you are able to also answer Anita's other question on the exact excise rate on beer. I know that you say that it depends on percentage, all right?
Right, so there's a tax incident rate, which is 23%, but above and beyond that, at manufacturing level, depending on the alcohol content, you get taxed at a staggered rate. So for 4%, you would get an excise rate, 4.5%, as mentioned, going on and so forth. And that's for the beer category in particular. We do have a staggered excise system in place according to the SARS schedules of our excises put into place.
Okay. Perfect to hear, but just feel free to add what you were going to say. But also, I think it would be nice to shift the conversation back to a question that came through earlier around, yes, this is the call for government to support this smaller businesses. What can big business do? So you got big business sitting right next to you. Perhaps if you can just also add a bit of color from your point of view, what you think big business can do better to support the smaller players.
Yeah, I think I just want to close off on this point. I think that Fatsani is also being a little bit conservative because she doesn't want to be very controversial. And this will come out, and it has to, and we have to also deal with the elephant in the room of historical taxing that has been taking place. We do not get any advantage as the beer industry for having the lowest ABV, which is your alcohol content, at all. So when we talk about using excise as an instrument in terms of also harm reduction, we're not getting an incentive for that at all. So even though we have an ABV, for example, on a bottle of beer, 4.5%, that doesn't help us any. We being responsible, we doing, encouraging moderation, etc. But the taxation for spirits and wine is not the same. And that's historical. So I think that that's something that in the long term you will see coming out, and it is definitely something we are dealing with. We've put it in our submissions to government, and we will continue to put it forward as the Beer Association, because I think the time has passed now where we need to give certain industries concessions. And we need to be fair. If we are talking about moderation and responsible drinking, we are an industry who is showing that we are doing that. Because we talk about moderation, we talk about responsible drinking. We have no alcohol that we promote. We give people choice. And I think that we should receive concessions for that. So I just want to say that we must know that as much as we're being taxed on our ABV, other industries are not. I just want to also share in terms of the impact and our transformation agendas, as well as women. And I think that Lucky is not mentioned, but his industry, for example, they are majority, not majority, but more than 50%, Lucky, you can correct me, are women-owned. Those taverns are run by women. In our industry as craft breweries, very sadly, and it might have been in some of the media, but I mean, we cannot forget people like Apiwe, who was the first brewster, which is a female brewer, to own a brewery in Johannesburg, who was shut down during lockdown. Now, how can we allow that as a country that's preaching transformation? How do we allow that? You talk about transformation in our country, and you talk about letting women, young black women, flourish in an industry that was a long time ago needing to be transformed. And here you are doing it as an industry, but because of COVID, because of circumstance, and we don't get support. And I won't go into the dynamics of which departments it was, but we had to intervene as the Beer Association because there was funding that was given to her in grants, and the money was demanded to be paid back. And no concessions were given to her, and she has now been shut down. All of her staff we tried to find alternative jobs. Luckily, we've managed to place them, but one has not been able to be placed. But this is a woman who has now having to be shut down and has had to find employment. And she was hope for so many young black women out there who wanted to become brewers. So we cannot just move on and dismiss the impact. We cannot. It's easy for us to move on as South Africans and think about that it was there. No, there were lives and livelihoods that were impacted here. And I think that we need to be very cognizant that however we move forward as a country, we need to really be pragmatic in our approach, but we need to also consider that we need to consult. And I think that's been the missing factor. And Fatsani's alluded to it in the beginning of this. The fact that we do not get consulted as an industry. And I know you curbed my colleague when he was starting to speak earlier on about our engagements with the DTIC. But we do not get consulted. And that is our ministry. We fall under, as liquor, under the DTIC. It's only under the Western Cape here from a provincial level that we fall under community safety. But a national level, we fall under DTIC, and we do not get consulted. And I really believe that that's a problem as an industry.
Right. No, thanks. Thanks so much, Patricia, especially for humanizing Apiwe's story. I mean, we were talking about Apiwe, and I'm sure there's a whole lot more stories untold. that one can share at this stage. But again, my question, we are going on at what we are asking this government to do, and I do appreciate it, the increased collaboration. Lucky you went as far as saying even a zero increase in terms of tax this time around just to support the recovery of your industry. But we also know that the private sector has got a very important role to play. The president has gone on about the significance, is it 80% or so, in terms of being drivers of jobs. And I want to ask the both of you, and perhaps Lucky, you can lead off and Patricia come back, as I had asked you previously. Just what are your asks then from private players, the big brothers in your industry like SAB, to support the recovery of your fragile industry right now?
So maybe let me start off with what Patricia mentioned around the ownership of the tavern space. So 54% of tavern owners in the country are women, and almost 60% of them are over the age of 55. So it just tells you the history of why these businesses exist in the first place. And this is to sustain their business or families as well. We have a good relationship with all liquor manufacturers. We are part of the Alcohol Industry Advisory Council, where we are able to engage with all the CEOs of liquor manufacturers in the country. So we've got that access. And during COVID, we received food packs. We received differences of in terms of payment of monies owed because we have accounts with almost all the liquor manufacturers where we buy on credit. So we were able to get that support from our manufacturers, and we continue to collaborate on important issues such as, for example, the alcohol harm reduction programs that we run in collaboration with manufacturers. But also we have now moved also into the space of gender-based violence, where the manufacturers have realized the need for us to play a much bigger role, just beyond just looking at the economics, but also looking at addressing social issues that are happening around the country. So we are comfortable and confident that our collaboration will just go beyond the economics, but also looking at the issues that affect the broader society. So just maybe for interest's sake, there's about 39,000 taverns in the country. We have a footfall of between 5 and 7 million people coming into our taverns on a month-to-month basis. And we've understood that responsibility, that because we've got a captive audience, we need to be able to do more than just selling alcohol, which is to engage with our patrons, our liquor traders on gender-based violence issues. But also, we run programs around tavern compliance, where we continue to educate liquor traders on compliance, not just with COVID-19 protocols, but as well as license conditions. It is important for liquor traders to protect their license, because that is their license to their livelihoods, to supporting their families.
I'm glad that you mentioned the issue around gender-based violence, because it was going to be another talking point around what the Taverns Association was also doing and playing its part to promote responsible drinking that we do know can have other negative effects. But the general sentiment that I'm getting then from you is that the private sector is already playing its part in the support. It's already doing all that it can do. And you're nodding, so I imagine that your sentiments are the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for us, it goes hand in hand. That if you play a role in a society, you have a responsibility in that society. And I think for me, it's a joint responsibility. So it's government's responsibility, it's us as the associations, our members' responsibility. But in terms of the role of private sector, which you specifically are asking me about, our members ensure that we have the funding for our projects, like Lucky has spoken about. So we partner with the projects on GBV. There's a fantastic project called the Green Door Project, that where women who are feeling vulnerable at any time of the night or the morning can go to specific houses that they know are safety houses. That all of these projects happen because of funding from members like SAB and Heineken, who are BASA members. And remember, we don't charge our craft members for membership because they cannot afford it. But it's the funding from SAB and Heineken which allows us to lobby for them. And so that's just another benefit in terms of what they're doing. There's other initiatives. We support the Social Development Ministry. We get a lot of support from the Deputy Minister of Social Development in terms of partnering with her on projects like the 999 project. Now, the 999 project is where we go to 9 provinces in 9 days, in the 9th month of every year, which is Social Development Month. And we go into these provinces and we actually go into communities and we talk about things like fetal alcohol syndrome. We actually meet children from fetal alcohol syndrome families. We actually talk to them about why it is important for them not to drink at a young age. There's various women that we'll speak to about gender-based violence. I can go on about the projects in terms of what we do with regards to harm, because harm and when you look at responsibility, it is a social issue. We have an issue as a country in terms of engaging with the substance, and that needs to come from engagement and interaction. And it is a problem that you need to deal with in terms of, Fatsani mentioned it, you isolate it. Who are the people that are having the problem? You can't put a blanket statement and say that, all South Africans have a drinking problem. That's not true.
Sure.
You need to find out where it is and tackle that. So I definitely believe that private sector is putting the money in to make sure that we identify these areas. But another area that we ignore is, everyone's here, lucky enough, those of you on the webinar, sorry that you're not with us in Cape Town. Not only do we have the beautiful Table Mountain and the wine routes, but we have over 70 brew routes in Cape Town alone. We have over 150 across the country. And that's something else, beer tourism, that they put money towards. Beer tourism is huge abroad, and in South Africa it's something that we have ignored. And if anyone hasn't done a brewery tour, please go onto our brew routes map. It's an actual map, and those of you who landed in Cape Town today, you would have seen as you exit the Cape Town airport, there would have been huge posters showing you the map. And you click on your mobile device and you're able to see where your local breweries are. You're able to go do a lovely beer tasting, get to know about the actual agriculture behind it, get to know how you actually brew, feel the hops, the barley, and just understand, we don't only have lager in South Africa. We have various different varieties. And so there's beer tourism, it's beer agriculture, there's a lot of different initiatives and entrepreneurs that are mentored. So
Sure.
I do believe the support that we get from private sector is sufficient, and I really do believe they do their best to promote this industry. I believe it's government support that we need most importantly going forward.
To come to the party a lot more. Thanks for that. Just once again, we are left with around 10 minutes or so for the session. So again, if there's any questions from the floor. Oh, yes, there is. So please.
Hi, Wesley Dipuko from Fast Company magazine. I'm just interested in the, future. What happens if government doesn't heed your call in terms of investments in the country and stuff like that? How will this impact?
I think that's a good question. Is there anyone else who'd like to say something on the floor? I think that's a good question, and for all of you. Perhaps, Fatsani, you can kick off.
I'll give SAB's angle, and then Patricia and Lucky
Sure.
can obviously say the impact of not getting an in-line with inflation adjustment or some excise reprieve. I think from SAB, what happens, and this is something that's not said explicitly, is that when you do think of investment and putting up a brewery, for instance, when we don't get an excise that gives us certainty or that says, okay, let's plan for the cost itself, what happens is that we have to think of, well, is the South African government giving us the business enabling environment to invest? And if not, are there other countries that are willing to give us the business enabling environment? Mozambique, for instance, has been open to setting up a brewery, which by way of giving tax reprieve and reducing the regulatory red tape for establishing business, in particular brewery, has given the signals appropriate, conducive for setting up a brewery. Of course, we pride ourselves in having an almost 100% localized value chain. But the more we get tax pressures, the more we get uncertainty around the direction of excise, the less the government creates an enabling environment for investment, and the more we have to diversify our costs. And that may include increasing imports of hops. Instead of getting it from our farmers, we'd have to source it or outsource it from other markets to keep cost pressures down. So the ripple effects of an excise tax that isn't in line with inflation is obviously diversifying our value chain away from being localized almost entirely to situating it in other markets and moving our investments to other African countries that are creating business enabling environments by way of taxes, by way of reducing red tape. And that obviously is counterintuitive to the logic that South Africa needs jobs and investments. And that's really what's going to happen at a practical level if excise is not adjusted in line with inflation
All right,
on Wednesday.
Okay, so a big opportunity cost then for the country. Patricia, what does it mean for your members if you don't get your way?
Yeah, I have so much to tell you, but we'll take it offline as well. But the first thing that will happen is this industry will decimate, because we've seen it. And had government locked us down this December, that's what would have happened. And I can't explain to you how anxious we were that this would happen. Right through to sort of New Year's Eve, we were still wondering, is this going to happen to us again? And so we will decimate an entire craft industry. That is what would happen. But over and above that, I just want to say that people will not stop drinking. That's the reality. And we should not kid ourselves about that. People will find alcohol. Those with a problem with drinking, those who have a problem with the substance, will continue drinking. All that would happen is they will move to the illicit economy. And so for us, it's not an option. Government needs to acknowledge this, that we have a problem and we need to work together. We've acknowledged it, we've accepted it, and we're willing to work with government to deal with the societal problem. But taxing us over and above inflation is not going to solve that societal problem. So people will still buy alcohol, they will get it somewhere, they will brew it themselves illegally with the wrong methodologies, etc. And people are going to then get injured. So you'd rather have a legal industry and allow them to thrive and support them, and they meet then the standards and regulations that you need in safe ways. But I think for me, when you look at our crime rates, that's also what's going to happen, is people are going to be unemployed. You're going to take, if you look at alcohol industry as a collective, we employ over 1 million livelihoods. So you are going to slowly decimate then an industry, if you look at a broader industry, and you're going to create more unemployment, and your crime rate is going to increase. We are seeing it, more and more people are desperate, and people are hungry. And that is what you're going to create in this country. So we cannot afford, and it's a ripple effect. And I think that we need to be aware of the bigger picture here. It may just be one little industry. It's not. We are a huge player, and there's an entire value chain, because then you can even move on to talk about the restaurant sector. And that's why I said there's so much to talk about. When you look at somebody who leaves school, I don't know about the young people now, but when I was still not even finished writing my exams, I already had a part-time job as a waitress lined up. Kids are spoiled these days. But you had to work, you had to study, you had to do everything to earn some money to survive. Where was it? Waitressing? That was where you could get your job. And when those restaurants closed down, what did those kids do? What did those young people who needed employment do? Where did they go? Where did they turn to? So you're going to have this cycle that's going to perpetuate itself. So I think for me, government really needs to pay attention to us. We really want to be part of the solution and not add to the problems.
Sure. Okay, point taken. And I think that the emphasis on the lose-lose scenario that you've painted is quite important, because, as you say, you make it more expensive. The people will drink who want to drink. They'll find ways to do so, and it will be in ways that doesn't necessarily contribute to what comes into SARS, as you've painted. But lucky if you don't get your way, What happens?
We won't go on a strike. I think for us it's unthinkable that government will not consider our requests. We understand that the Minister of Finance has competing interests. We fully understand that. But what will happen for us on the ground is that you will erode profitability at the tavern level. And once you do that, it means then our liquor traders have to bump up the price so that they can remain competitive and they can stay in business. But then indirectly, you are then cropping up the illicit trade, which is already it has taken serious hold in the township space. And if you look at almost the 10 million people that are unemployed in the country, the majority of them are in the township. So you have now created this cocktail of anarchy waiting to happen in the township space where these unemployed youths are actually now part of the runners of the illicit guys. So you have a legal tavern operating, but then on the other hand, you have an illicit guy who's also running, but at 43% less price than your legal person. So, and when they run out of stock, the illicit guys, then they go and hit the taverns. That's why now you're seeing a spike in robberies that are taking place at taverns across the country. So it is a big problem for us. So we are hoping that government is going to meet us halfway by creating an environment that allows for the legal traders to thrive and not support the illegal guys who do not even pay tax.
Sure. Final question coming from the online audience. Thanks so much for your contribution. Fatzani, perhaps you can have a jab at answering it. So it's asking about a minimum unit pricing model. And perhaps this even goes to some of the long-term thinking around policy that you did make mention of. But whether SAB is considering a minimum unit pricing model instead of the current excise tax structure.
Once the government, and I think in terms of the excise policy view and the guidelines that currently exist, one of the pillars and suggestions that has come up both from SAB's perspective and as the government is whether we need to just replace the tax incident rates with a minimum unit pricing system. The issue with that, on the one side, is it easy for SARS to administer, first of all? The SARS administration obviously already is under pressure to administer current taxes, and a minimum unit pricing system creates its own complexities in the way that it's implemented. But SAB has taken the position is that, firstly, is it easy to administer, and taxes seem to be in the current form enough for the SARS administration to administer, and secondly, is it going to be a value additional in the efficiency and effectiveness of the excise tax policy to again replace or either put a sort of nuance that says minimum unit pricing is necessary. So whilst the principle still remains that if there is harmful consumption and if the government wants to get revenue from excise taxes, there should be a structure in place. Our position as SAB is that really, is it really beneficial to the current tax system and the constraints on the administration side to put a minimum unit pricing system, and will it be easy for SARS to administer? We believe that the current tax system, there is an opportunity to create more fairness, as Patricia has said, and the consistency on that basis is more revenue raising than just putting in place a minimum unit pricing system. And I think that's our approach, is to say the current system actually doesn't have a fair tax base.
Sure.
And that in itself is an opportunity for SARS and National Treasury to collaborate to deal with that, first of all, and sort of the complexity of minimum unit pricing is dependent on the ability of SARS to administer that sort of complex model at a tax base.
All right, perfect. That question coming from Daniel Gregory, and I hope that did answer it. We have shared a lot, and we have really come towards the end of today's session. But I suppose just to wrap up, and in terms of closing remarks, if I could just ask each of you to share them. And just given that you have shared a lot already, perhaps we can limit it to a couple of characters. That would be the case on Twitter using the hashtag #ForTodayTax for Growth. So limit your response to a tweet. And if you had to sum up your parting message today, Lucky, in a tweet, how many characters does Twitter give you? Is it 36 or 27? I don't know. If you had to sum it up in a tweet, tax for growth, what would your departing message be?
Liquor traders remain committed to working with government, civil society, and our communities to make sure that we continue to sell alcohol in a responsible way and encourage our patrons to consume responsibly.
All right, perfect. Patricia?
5% inflation rate. Give us a concession.
Hashtag tax for growth. Perfect. Fatsani?
Keep it in line with inflation. For investment, for job opportunities, hashtag tax for growth.
All right. Okay, perfect. And thank you. So I can't forget you. Perhaps if we just have a parting thought from yourself, sir.
Sorry, it's a parting, it's really to amend an error that I made. If you work on the basis of a 42.7 billion rand take for excise duty, that includes tobacco products, by the way, and you abolish, if you take the extra 8% that was paid this last year and bring it down to inflation of 5%, that means a 3% concession on 42.3 billion rand is about 1.3 trillion rand that can go into investment. If you go one step further and abolish excise duties completely, then you're talking about you're talking about, sorry, not abolish the increase in excise duties completely. You're talking about 4.3 billion rand. If I'm sorry, if you don't have the total increase of 5%, if you stick to inflation, would be about 2 to 2.5 trillion rand. And that is what we are actually talking around.
Okay.
We're talking about a concession that would give the industry some 2 billion rand extra that is available for investment. Now you divide that by how many taverns? 39,000, and you get the concession that would be made to every tavern. You're probably talking about 5 to 10,000 rand. It's not huge, but can make a big difference to small organizations.
All
like
right.
that.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for providing that clarity. That sounded more like a Facebook or a LinkedIn post, hashtag tax for growth. But it's fine. We have got participants who have been joining us on that platform. Thank you. And to the colleagues in the room, there's going to be one-on-one interviews that the speakers, I believe, have made themselves available for those of you who are trying to scoop your exclusive or just get more information in further clarity, and that will be set up in just a bit. From myself, it has been quite an informative session, I must say. Even as a journalist myself, I have been aware of what has been going on in your industry and the various relief measures that were extended across industries, and I don't think I understood to the extent the lack of relief that the alcohol industry at large and beer industry wasn't given, on top of the fact that trading conditions were made difficult with the excise, with the bans on liquor sales. I wasn't aware to the degree it has made business difficult. And, you know, while we do have a drinking problem in this country, and it's something that it does need very careful attention given to, it is also true that your industry is responsible for sending so many people to school, for giving people a livelihood, and it's certainly one that cannot be ignored or one that cannot be just viewed in a negative prism. So I'm certainly looking forward to developments that will come out from the budget speech on Wednesday and the developments from your industry subsequent to us knowing exactly what the plan is. So with that said, I'd like to wrap up and hand it back to the individual, the man who kicked us off, Mr. Spe. It's over to you, sir.
Awesome sauce. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today. We really appreciate it. On behalf of the South African Breweries, really a huge thank you to you, Fifi, Fitsani, Patricia, Lucky, Dr. Jamin. A huge thank you to you for that. As she was saying, we have set up your one-on-one interview station outside, literally behind this wall, so you can go out that wall and go down and make another right. Everyone is there to really to engage with you there. Before we do that, though, I would just like to have a photo opportunity with all of the participants today, and thereafter they will be going to that one-on-one area. And then at your leisure, you can absolutely have lunch at the back as you feel comfortable to do so. But really a huge thank you to you and a wonderful day to you.